So this lesson focuses on entities, and these are basically custom types that you can define. So why are types important? Types, help us catch bugs, right? So if I've defined a predicate whose keys are like language and content are of type string, and I try to put in like an integer in there, I'll get an error. So if you actually try to do that, you'll get like what's called a type error, and it will tell you that it needs a string instead of an integer. So should be pretty straightforward for most people. So can anybody spot the bug in this code?
Name and language misplaced.
Right. So the name and language the order is reversed. And in the last logical block where it says person speaks, it says language and name. Now, since both of these are defined as strings, the compiler will just say, I just couldn't find a person speaks with a name where you gave me language because it just didn't match. But it was a string, so there was no type error. But that rule wouldn't evaluate to anything, so you basically not get the data you're expecting. So so far we've kind of been defining like greetings and like languages and like a person and what language they speak as strings. So we want to start using like entities, right? We want to define a person and we want to define a language. So we'll kind of look at that in a second here. So the way you declare an entity is you just have person p right arrow dot. So that's all fine and dandy, but we really can't reference this entity by anything. So we've got an entity predicate. I can basically use that in other rules. So if I have the person speaks rule, now takes in a person, and that person is an actual entity type person. So instead of using strings everywhere, for example, if we were using strings as before and we had person, Lisa speaks, French and John speaks English and so forth, eventually we'll get a bunch of repetition of these strings, right? So it's not good for, you're using more memory when you could just be using like a foreign key to another predicate, basically. So if we look at that error again, now that we've defined a person, we'll get a type inconsistent error because before we had language and person as strings, so the runtime couldn't tell that there was an issue. It just said I couldn't find that data you were looking for. So now that we have that same bug, but we have the language and the person is an entity type person, we'll get an actual type inconsistent error. So the way we refer to these entities is by defining a reference mode, and you can think of a reference mode as kind of like the unique key for that role in like a table, right? So if I have a person, here we have a reference mode called person name, so we're going to uniquely identify people by their name. Probably not the best example because a lot of people have the same names, but we'll just stick with a small world of 10 people. So we have the entity predicate, person P. We have the reference mode for that predicate, which is the person name, and that name is defined as type string. And this is a one-to-one function, so an entity can only have one unique key, right? You're identifying it by one primary key, I suppose. It's an analogy. And the reference mode can be basically any primitive type, so it could be an integer, it could be a float. Probably wouldn't want to use a Boolean because it's not much sense, but you could. So we can construct entities using the reference mode. So if we We add some logic where we have the entity and the reference mode definition use an add block. We install that logic into the workspace, and then we execute a transaction using lbexec, and we're asserting a new person into the predicate, and that person's name is Sarah. So you can see here that we're using delta logic, where the plus operator is there, to assert into person and add a person name as a reference mode. And if we print hello world person, we'll actually get the reference mode out as a as the value, because the runtime knows that the person predicate has a reference mode, and it will kind of just dump that out for you. The 3 you see there, the number 3, that's kind of like an internal primary key that the runtime uses to identify these values. So the 3 basically refers to that variable p. Really, it's basically that instance of person. Internally, it's referred to with the number 3. Now, you don't really use that number. This is kind of for the workspace to basically identify these relationships between the data in different predicates. So when it references them, it uses that value. So if we execute the same transaction again with lbexec, what do you guys think would happen? So if I've already, go ahead. Yeah, so you wouldn't, since we're using sets here, we can't have the same thing, the same unique entity in the same predicate. So if I basically execute the same transaction, I wouldn't get a duplicate because we're using sets instead of buckets. So that's the difference between like kind of your old SQL database where you can have multiple rows with the same data. Here, everything's unique because it's in 6 normal form. So we basically, executing the same transaction twice, you wouldn't get a duplicate value.
I have a small question.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go back? So, can you tell me once again what was this 3 number? It's just like a number that pops up whenever you add a row.
So the 3 is basically when you print a predicate. That number is basically kind of the internal reference number that the database uses to refer to these entities. Okay. So if I had another predicate that was referencing that same person and I printed some of the data in it, you'd see the 3 again show up for that person. But these are all unique inside the workspace. They're not like unique, like globally unique identifiers. So if I was to destroy the workspace and recreate it, that number too. It depends on like what way the data got into the workspace. So it's not really useful for identifying data like as a unique key because it's only relative for the database that currently lives on your hard drive.
So developer won't have to do anything with that. It's just internal how the database works. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. So again, here we can use the predinfo command to look at some information about the predicate, and we can see here that for person, we can actually see that there's a reference mode. So it actually tells you, hey, this entity has a reference mode person name. So you can kind of basically, run some queries and like look at, oh, it's got a reference mode. Let me see what that is. So if we do, predinfo and person name, now that's the ref mode itself. So it actually tells us this is a reference mode predicate. So ref mode conversion. This is basically, if I define, person speaks and person and language are entities. I can basically assert some facts into these predicates, and you just specify, the entity and the reference modes, and you're essentially when you do plus person speaks, it will basically tie those, the variables P and L to those languages and to the language and the person. So you're basically referencing the entities you're adding into the new predicate. So we also have constructors, and constructors can be thought of as kind of like a compound key identifier. So reference modes are a one-to-one mapping, and they're also EDB only. So you can't have like an IDB rule, you create a reference mode. But for constructors, you can actually have, for example, if I want to identify like a person by their first and last name, and I want to use that as kind of the unique identifier, that's when you use a constructor. So it's a multi-dimensional key identifier. So in this example, I've defined a person entity, and I'm defining a person from first, last constructor, and that's basically going to use the first and last name of that person to reference this predicate. So if I want to basically find John Smith, like which entity is that, I'll basically query this constructor predicate and find that person, and then I can use that person variable to join on other predicates. So basically using it to identify the actual entity, and then using the variable of the entity to basically tie it into other predicates. So here's an example of basically executing a transaction and adding a new person using a constructor. So I'm adding a person entity P, and then I'm specifying that the constructor values for first and last name for that entity P. And again, here you can do the same thing with IDB logic. So this was EDB, since we have delta logic, the plus signs. You can do the same thing with IDB here. Say that we have some input that comes from somewhere else that gives us first and last name. We can define basically a rule that uses that to basically populate the constructor and the entity itself. So if we have some logic and we execute plus input Sarah Jones, it will trigger that rule. That rule will say there's an input with first and last names Sarah Jones, and it will basically derive into the constructor and the predicate person. So reference mode versus constructors. Constructors can be, like I said, EDB or IDB, just as we saw on the last slide. You can use delta logic to add, entities through a constructor, or you can define IDB rules that take some other EDB predicate and turn that and derive that into the entity itself. In reference modes, the reference mode is EDB only, so you have to use delta logic or the assertion operators with the plus sign to basically instantiate like an instance of that entity. So basically summary of concepts, entities are user-defined types. They leverage the compiler to catch bugs because you have basically type constraints. And the reference modes basically give you kind of like a unique key identifier for a certain entity. They give you a one-to-one mapping in the entity to the reference mode, and they can be of any primitive type. So do you guys have any questions on the whole entities, constructors? So typically I haven't had the need to use constructors a lot. I use reference modes because I have some data and I need to reference it. And usually you have a unique key, or you can also generate and auto increment it like a reference mode. So there's more on that if you look at the logic blocks reference manual, but you can have like an auto incrementing basically key that you use as a reference mode, just so you can kind of have like similar to how you have a primary key in like your SQL database that goes from 1, 2, 3, whatever, 4, 5, 6. You just use it as an identifier for that row. So is everybody good on entities?
Let's see practice.
I think things might get clearer when you start playing around with it using the exercises provided. So I'd say maybe let's get started with the exercises and then discuss questions as they come up. How does that sound?
Yep. Sounds good.
Yeah.